In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head. Just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Hello, Planet Earth. Welcome back to another episode of It's Not Just in Your Head. My name is Max Golding, LMFT, an actual therapist, I suppose. And Harriet is unfortunately not with us today, but we do have two very cool human beings who are union organizers. One is sort of like professionally a union organizer, Tedwood Strong, who uses they, them pronouns and is a campaign lead for CODE-CWA. CWA stands for Communication Workers of America, by the way, if you don't know the acronym. CODE-CWA is a campaign to organize digital employees, and Tedwood is also a former animator. And we also have Jen Garcia, who identifies as a reformed animator and a current software engineer who just thinks the unions are rad. She also is an organizer, not in the professional staff considered way, but maybe a little bit kind of similar to how I'm an organizer. Like, I don't have a fancy title, but I don't know. I kind of do some labor organizing stuff. So why do we have two organizers? Me and Harriet are therapists, and we're supposed to just talk about what's in your head, because that's what mental health is. It's just stuff in your brain or whatever, right? Well, we wanted to have a really hopefully fun and maybe kind of depressing conversation about boss psychology. So this will probably go a few different directions. It is so anyone who has not been either part of a union or trying to form a union at work, if you haven't, it may not be as obvious, although I think some of this will be intuitive and obvious for most people who've had jobs in their lives. But there's this question of like, well, how do bosses and managers react to workers trying to form a union? And then we're going to do a little bit of like, not like diagnosing or trying to be like mental health professional status about it, because that's not helpful, but to just like talk about this and analyze it a little bit. Like, why does there seem to be an almost universal, I'm assuming you guys can correct me, but an almost universal kind of reaction and set of predictable reactions that managers and bosses tend to have when they find out that their workers are organizing? We can talk a little bit about some of the psychology of it'll be maybe just me, like maybe saying some psychology crap, but I don't think you need like formal or professional psychology training to talk about this. So in any case, hello, Tedwood, and hello, Jen.
Hey, thanks for having us on.
Yes, hello.
Yeah, why, hello. Okay, so boss psychology. So what is it? Why do bosses love unions? And why do they have such outstanding, amazing, supportive, validating reactions to their workers whenever they find out their workers want to collectively bargain with them?
Well, every time a union forms in a workplace and they go public, you hear the boss say, almost unilaterally, like, I respect your right to make whatever decision you want. I, care about you deeply. This company is not solely for profit. We are here for you all and to grow together. So yeah, like, why shouldn't they love unions? I mean, those are all of the things. Those are all of the tenets, as you will, for wanting a union in the first place. So why wouldn't they, right?
Yeah. Well, okay, so sarcasm aside and jokes aside, how would y'all, in y'all's experience, how do, because also for listeners, like, so I think we should assume that there's a fair amount of listeners who already kind of know what we're going to say about how bosses tend to react, but there's a lot of folks who just have no idea. They've never thought about this, right? Like, unions aren't like the most normal thing in the US, right? So some people are like, I actually had in my experience trying to organize my workplace years ago, people saying like, oh yeah, like I think our managers are really like progressive and stuff. Like, they'd probably support us. Right. And I'd be like, let's go talk over there real quick. Like, I don't, that's actually probably not what's going to happen. So in like real life, right? What have the reactions been that y'all have seen in how bosses react when they hear about an organizing campaign?
Honestly, extremely emotionally. I think for the most part, it's very common for them to take it personally. Like, you're attacking me and you're attacking my baby. And so, yeah, they tend to lash out. And I think that that you get that reaction regardless of whether it's a progressive boss or not. They're just hurt. Like, how could you? How could you? Especially since I have been feeding and clothing you for X amount of time by giving you this job. I am a job creator. How dare you?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I think about like the distinction between somebody like Jeff Bezos, who, everybody thinks of as like the monocle and top hat person at the top of the ivory tower, who isn't actually a human being, versus like the mom and pop shop, like the campaign that Jen and I were just on at Floyd County Productions, where the CEO Matt Thompson is like, he started this company by himself and raised it up to a company with 200 plus employees, largest animation studio in Georgia. And I think about the distinction between the two, and there is a distinction, right? Because like you've poured your heart, from your perspective, you poured your blood, sweat, and tears into this, and this is something that you are personally invested in, working very hard to maintain. And so, I guess the popular idea of unions in the United States, especially now, is if a union forms at your place of business, your business that you own, it means that you're fucking up. You've made horrible mistakes in how you treat your employees, and so who couldn't take that personally, especially when they see themselves as trying their hardest to like do the fair thing, but also make all the unilateral decisions and not give employees a say.
So you're both kind of, to synthesize or mix together like the two responses you all just had. Like, one is so Jen, you said it's like it's emotional. It's sort of like this is like psychology terms, kind of, not psychology really, but like personalizing. So it's like a personal attack, right? Like it's even if the workers are really clear, like we just want to make sure that we have a fair, we as a group of people who are working for you want to make sure it doesn't, you could do it in a really nice way, but they still kind of take it as a personal attack. It's a big emotional reaction they have. And then I think I'm kind of using some therapist terms just to like ground it a little bit. But Tedwood, you actually kind of just validated validation for the bosses. You were saying like, well, because it makes sense, right? From their perspective, they put the blood, sweat, and tears. Probably, I don't know if you mentioned this just now, but like risk, like they usually say, like I took the risk of taking out the loans or I don't know, using mom and dad's money that I inherited, or whatever the process is. Not to like, sometimes that's the case, right? But they feel like I've put in such a disproportionate amount of time and effort and taken risk, and so and this is not like, just to contextualize this. This isn't just a reaction to like all the workers saying, you treat us like crap, we're going on strike, or like we're going to like tie you up in a basement and force you to like give us co-ownership or like make us equal partners. And also like, you don't get any money anymore. We get all the money, right? Like it's nothing like extreme.
No.
You're saying these are reactions to just like when they hear that the workers might, like not even that they are, but like they might be forming a union, or they're talking about forming a union, or they are officially kind of forming a union, or they're just organizing generally, right?
Right.
So these
for when you're trying to form a union, the demand there is that the workers have a seat at the decision-making table. And so we're going to make the decision together. And, obviously it is within all parties' best interests. We're trying to negotiate in good faith. So no, nobody will be tied up in the basement, against their will. But even the idea of having that conversation is threatening.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
I would imagine a lot of bosses think, if I allow my employees to take over what I've worked so hard to build, I'm being cucked in some sort of way, right? And I mean, I think that's like, especially with like predominantly white male bosses in the world. I mean, that's probably a thing. Yeah.
So it's like so there's like an ego thing, right? Like it's, again, not it, because I guess maybe to validate bosses a little bit more, not to be too mean about it. Like if you really did put in that much time and energy into something, and you do feel like it was your baby, and like literally nobody else, or at least in your head, in your mind, you're like, nobody else helped me. I, as this like rugged individual, did all this stuff on my own. It could make sense that you'd actually feel like personally threatened, right? That people are actually trying to take something from you that you created like out of thin air or whatever, or even if you acknowledge that you were helped by like the bank or like certain, I don't know, we don't have to get into all the millions of things that like allow for like quote unquote free enterprise to like freely enterprise. But like, we all know here, like it's not, nobody does just out of thin air create a business. But so, yeah. Okay. So it's like feeling threatened, feeling hurt. And then I could kind of see from there, the fight or flight thing happens where, you feel like triggered, I guess. And you're like, an important part of my identity, who I am, that like ego psychology structure thing just gets like threatened. And then you feel like you have to react. And obviously you can't. So in the fight or flight idea, like you can't run away from your workers. You can't run away from the business. So maybe, I guess now you just feel like, well, I have no choice. I have to kind of fight back against my workers who are like coming after me now by wanting a union.
Right. And even in cases where the employee, voluntarily recognizes their employees, they'll still hire legal counsel to, sort of lay out the strategic land there, to try to find out like, where is this weak? Like, where can we maybe dissuade people that they don't actually want this, even, while they're saying publicly, like, we support all workers' rights to form a union. And if that's what the workers really want here, then we'll have that with card check neutrality or whatever. There's still some, sense of undermining there. I want to go back to something, because you mentioned, you kept mentioning validation for the bosses. And, one of the things we try to do, like when we're having, especially one-on-one conversations with people and they have objections, everybody has an objection to forming a union. I have objections to forming a union. Like I have, things that could stop me from wanting to organize with my coworkers and put myself on the line to make change. And whenever that comes up, like you want to validate that this is a rational thing that you're thinking about. Like, yeah, what if I do get fired? And so like validating the boss's idea of like, yeah, you did put in a lot of work onto this. Like you did take a lot of risks at the beginning. It's important to validate that stuff. But the follow-up is always like, here's my perspective on it, or here's maybe a different way to think about it. You put all the risk into this. The workers are not trying to take that away or discount that. They're not trying to take over your company and take everything you own. All they're saying is that now that you've taken the risk and now that you've put all this work into this, you've brought us into this mix, this situation with you where we are also taking a risk. We are also putting in, at least 40 hours of our weeks, and we deserve a proportionate amount of decision-making power. And so in a lot of ways, it's not revolutionary at all. It's just, it's normal. But I think our culture is, the culture, the cultural view of unions that we all get from the school system and media and all of that. Like unions are corrupt, like they're just a bunch of ungrateful people. They protect lazy workers, all of those things. And so I guess I'm saying all that to say that, the psychology of the boss in that situation is not unlike the psychology of the worker in that situation. They will have often the same objections. It just changes according to their circumstance, what they're able to do about that objection.
Yeah. Okay. In my experience, there was this a while ago, we didn't get far beyond the organizing. I guess maybe just for listeners. So like, when you're doing the form a union thing, you want to try as best you can to form what's called an organizing committee. So it's not just like one person thinking they have this like hero cape and they're going to like get everybody together in a workplace, because that's just kind of not possible. So you get like a small group who like kind of meets regularly, and then like, then you kind of go from there and you like make some plans, and you plan to talk to other people and everything. We didn't get too much further beyond that, but like I've always had like a teeny tiny conspiracy theory in the back of my head that because not too long after we had the like strongest organizing committee we had had two separate organizing committees over like a 3-year period because things fell apart. But the stronger one in the beginning, there were some consultants brought in not too long after that interviewed like everybody in the mid-sized nonprofit company to try to like get some like data to be like, okay, now let's do some restructuring so that everybody's happier. And then they created this sort of like this like really large committee that had like reps from every department plus like a couple of managers, right? And then I heard later on from people like, oh, that's like a super common thing that they do when they hear that there's a union on its way. So I've always had like I never had proof, but I've had this like little conspiracy theory in my head. So like I guess going back to what you're saying with the they'll like hire lawyers and stuff, lawyers, consultants, surveys, right? Like I've heard these are really common things where they don't necessarily look threatening, but it's like suddenly the boss seems, and before they weren't concerned, but now they're like, we want to really make sure that like everybody's happy and that like we're following the rules and that everybody's feedback is being heard. But for some reason, they just don't want it to happen through a union where it's like just the workers themselves controlling the conversation.
Yeah.
I mean,
whenever
that?
you see what those are generally called employee resource groups. Whenever you see a group like that popping up, you need to interrogate where its power comes from. And like if the power comes from the workers, then and it's like a self-directed thing coming from the workers, then that is seen as more threatening to the boss than something that the boss puts in place and says, okay, you have like they are sanctioning this group to exist for a specific purpose, and they can dissolve it also at any time.
Right.
And ultimately, it's about like keeping their power. So you create these groups so that people feel like they're heard, but ultimately they don't challenge the power of the boss, and that's why they're allowed to exist and sometimes encouraged.
Yeah. It's also really important to distinguish like what it is between those two types of groups, unions and ERGs, or employee worker councils or whatever.
Right.
In terms of like what their model of power is. For a union, the workers need to understand that the only clear source of power that they have is their labor. The fact that they do all the things, they can withhold that labor. Employee resource groups, often are not focused around that. And I think that's, why, C teams and bosses in nonprofits will try to form them.
Yeah. And it's
sort of like an NPO and Intelpro, if you will.
What's that? NPO Intelpro? Like COINTELPRO?
Yeah.
It's over my head.
Yeah. Sorry. Like nonprofit organization.
Oh wow. Oh, that is quite a term. Is that like an online left thing I've missed? That's like,
I think some staff organizers and I made it up the other day.
okay.
We're organizing with a nonprofit right now, and some stuff is happening. So
yeah, nonprofits are weird in that way. I do think that there's still like a generic sense of like, oh, it's non-profit. Like there's this almost a psychology that kicks in when you see the phrase non-profit. Oh, well, it's not for profit, so it's like good, and it's good people. The bosses are good. There aren't even bosses. It's just like people doing good stuff. Just this like kind of silly thing where it's like, well, they operate usually like business, any other business, and so anyway, that was the setting in which I tried organizing, and it was kind of a nightmare.
yeah.
So NPO Telpro. Is that the
Yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah, and to your point earlier, like this idea that it's a conspiracy theory that popped in your head. I'm just going to say the catchphrase of the show. It's not all in your head. Like that is legitimately a thing that nonprofits, especially like mission driven companies, will often try to do. I mean, it happened at Medium where they had these little ERGs. Alphabet has massive ERGs that the company funds and can pull funding from.
Right.
And another nonprofit, that we're working with now, they have like a workers council that talks directly to the VP. So
yeah. Well, yeah, it's weird stuff. I mean, so we have like mainly pretty lefty listeners too, so it's probably safe to say, I think. So if you're coming from an almost Marxy kind of perspective, you're like, well, the workers are the ones that create the value, right? Like we kind of maybe take that perspective for granted sometimes, like not realizing like not everybody thinks that way, or they haven't arrived at that conclusion. But I guess from that perspective, it's like obvious. Well, of course you should have a union because the workers are the ones that create the even going back to like because there's the validation piece for the bosses, but I think some of it should be invalidated though, right? To be a little bit more real about it, right? Where it's like you as an individual may have done X, Y, and Z, but again, like if you have 5 or 10 or 50 or 1,000 employees that work 40 hours a week and everything, the only way for you to actually make the amount of money you're making is through the labor of the workers, right? So I think that's just the more like real talk piece.
Yeah.
That I think is a much stronger case for why unions should be present in like every work. I mean, if the workers want it, like not that we shouldn't be like forcing unions.
Yeah. But I mean, obviously people they don't think about it that way most of the time. And then, if you say like our power to withhold our labor is very strong, like it's almost cliche to say that. People know this.
Right.
It's not like they don't know it. It's not like they're uneducated about it. They know what Marxism is. Like they get it. But like the idea here is like, why would I want to do that? Why would I? What's the benefit of me doing that? And often that's very hard to see, especially like when you're kind of siloed. And there's just so like it can't be understated, like the weight of just cultural indoctrination that we're all under, including workers and bosses. Like, and that's why, you have to be so intentional about forming a solid committee who's going to have relationships all over the workplace, who are committed to doing one-on-one conversations. And when you go public and you hear the messaging from the boss where they react emotionally and take it very personal and all this and try to guilt trip you and gaslight you out of wanting a union, that's why it's so important to have a committee there, a group of strong people who are going to invalidate that message and take it over.
I think it's really important for people, or especially workers that work at like quote unquote nice jobs. Like you have a nice desk job and you have a nice progressive boss, and everything seems like why would I want a union? I don't have anything to, I guess, quote unquote complain about. But ultimately we have to really stress with people that like we're creating the value and we should have a seat at the table, and it's going to be very shocking when your nice progressive boss comes out with these tactics and hiring lawyers and doing captive audience meetings. And you have to be prepared for that and keep it in your mind that this is going to be a fight. You're not going to just, be handed a union on a silver platter. And I almost feel like we have to work more on the psychology of the workers in like quote unquote nice, boss situation. Because the boss is going to boss, and regardless of what their personal ideology is, or whether they've consider themselves progressive or conservative or what have you, really it's the workers that if they're shocked at that like boss reaction, and it catches them flat-footed, then your campaign can't continue.
Yeah. I think we both are feeling that, especially right now. Like, we're just coming off of this 2-year long campaign from, Floyd County, where we both used to work for nearly a decade. And I think one of the mistakes that we've both kind of reflected on together is, like, we needed to be very clear and not wavering on the fact that this is a fight, and people need to have their hands in front of their face instead of in their pockets, just to convince people that, or to make them realize that, there is a contradiction here, and there is going to be a fight. Because, when if you go public and you're spreading this positive message energy about, like, we want to work in good faith with management, and that's all you have, you don't have an escalation plan. Once they come out and say, well, you're just creating a bunch of division here, and it's fine the way it is. We give you pizza parties. What's wrong with you? Like, and it shocks people.
Just like that.
Just exactly like that.
Like a monster.
Yeah. I mean, the people react in the same way that they would to, a terrifying monster. They'll just, they'll shut down. They'll think it's ugly. They'll want to, check out of it, and that means if they're checking out of all of it, they're checking out of, like, your messaging too. So inoculation is so important there.
I wanted to ask, Jen, you mentioned captive audience meeting, and then also the worker psychology. I would love to go back to that in a minute, but just for listeners who don't know, what's a captive audience meeting?
Sure. A captive audience meeting is a meeting organized by the boss where basically the workers are required to attend. And in the context of, say, a contract campaign where the workers are unionizing and would like to, get recognition either voluntarily or through the National Labor Relations Board, in a captive audience meeting, the boss basically forces you to sit through anti-union messaging. And bosses have a unique advantage over the workers, particularly in the United States, because, they can pay you to sit there and listen to anti-union messaging, whereas the union organizers are only allowed to talk to workers, when in their off time or during lunch, and off-site. So it becomes an imbalance where where the boss can basically, quote unquote, outspend the union organizers in terms of employee time and attention.
I would imagine it would really burn some people out too, right? Where, like,
yes,
if that's a 1 or 2 or 3 hour meeting or something, like, you might be like, I don't want to go to the next organizing committee meeting, or I don't want to, whatever the extra work is for the union, you're just like, I'm worn out. I don't really want to do this now. Right.
Yeah. This, to me, it works very much in the same way as somebody who's trying to actively gaslight you all of the time. The only way to really stop them from doing that is to disincentivize them, right? Like, to interrupt them and say, no, this is what you did, and here's the receipt from when you did it and said it. If you do that enough times, that they'll stop, trying to do that. And so with captive audience meetings, like, the only way to keep them from doing that, and the only reason bosses stop doing them in campaigns, is when, groups of workers take those meetings over and, interrupt and say, look, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you're just saying some things that are completely false here, and let me clarify a few things, or just asking, like, fuck you questions. Like, there's this famous example of, some nurses organizing at a hospital up in Pennsylvania, where they held a captive audience meeting, and one of the nurses, and they trained them to do this. They prepped them to do this beforehand. She stood up and she said to the rector who was speaking, like, Pope John Paul II said that, unions are doing the Lord's work. Was Pope John Paul II wrong, sir? And it's just a rhetorical question. It's like one of those, who gotcha questions. But the more that happens, the more resistance there is. Like, the less likely it is they'll want to continue holding these long ass meetings for folks.
So the worker psychology, this actually makes me think whether we, like, I was thinking of maybe of us titling this episode like boss. I was maybe thinking, like, instead of boss psychology, like boss versus worker psychology or something, because the worker psychology bit is, so I'm now thinking just a little bit from my own experience, things I've seen in the news, what y'all are talking about is that like the main thing I'm assuming y'all can like correct this, but that the fear is going to be one of the main impediments, right, for most workers because of things they've heard, because of like I think you just said, Tedwood, like people kind of like you don't need to like Marx-splain at people too much of like, well, there's labor theory of value and there's this and there's that. I mean, it kind of helps to like know your theory, but I think most people just kind of get it. Like, yeah, the boss is trying to pinch pennies and they'll fire me if they don't, you know what I mean? Like, it's duh, right? It's sort of known, but because of that, I think too, even, I mean, what I'd found, and I still, in tenant organizing, I find this too, like you can even sort of like tell people what their rights are. Well, no, they can't fire you for this or da 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 da. And people, I think, inherently kind of know the power imbalance. Like it's like in their bones. They're like, yeah, but they have more power than me. They don't need to articulate it, but they're just like, but they might fire me and I need this job. And, right. And so that like the psychology that you need to like, I guess just the bravery, the courage, the risk to say like, you know what, there is some risk. If more of us get involved, though, it's less risky. And this is really important for us and just for, I don't know, like the world or something, like whatever. I don't know what, everyone's motivated by different things. But like, how do you, once you see that like the boss is kind of losing their shit and they're cracking down on people because of a thing that like it doesn't actually have any like negative effect on them. It might reduce their profit margins a bit, like, but I mean, most of the time it just sort of like gives them a little bit less power over the workers, like gives the workers more power. But once you start to see that, right, like how do workers like overcome that fear and this internalization of like helplessness and this like wanting to revert back to, well, before all this union crap, like I could just kind of like hang my head low and just do my job and go home and, you know what I mean? Like, how do you overcome that stuff? It must be really hard.
Yeah, I think that, and whenever we do trainings for trying to do union organizing, we really emphasize the importance of the one-on-one conversation. And one of the core foundation of the one-on-one conversation is that when you're talking to a worker, you need to get at the root of a particular problem that they have that affects them, in their day-to-day, that can affect them at home, that they, kind of think about in their off hours, and get them to associate the solution to that deep problem with, organizing with other people, because they know that they can't do that by solve that problem by themselves. And so, ultimately we talk about solidarity and being there for each other. But the root of the organizing conversation is still self-interest, in that you have this deep problem that is bothering you and you think about every day, and you, through your coworkers, is how you can solve that problem. So whenever we get into these like sticky situations of people feeling cold feet, we go back to whatever that initial agitation, that deep-rooted problem is, and get people to realize that, that unless we organize, that problem isn't going to go away.
Yeah, I something that I often have missed in the past, and I think a lot of other people miss too, is that it's also not only about what really really deeply concerns you, what agitates you and motivates you to want to do something about it, but it's the relationship that you have with the people around you who you could act in solidarity with but choose not to. Right? Like, what is the relationship between me and this person, my coworker? Is that relationship stronger than their relationship with the boss? Right? Like, this is a guy that signs your paychecks. Is my relationship to you stronger, and is your community relationship stronger among the workforce than that which you have with the boss?
Yeah, that's super important. And through our campaigns, There have been tons of times when, people show up at meetings and we ask, just as a kind of icebreaker question, like, why did you come to this meeting? And the worker will say, well, because so and so asked me to. That relationship is so important for getting people to want to work together.
How do you... I guess I have like a bigger question. So there's like the worker level psychology of like overcoming the fear, trying to find that solidarity with coworkers, like kind of, and I think also once it clicks that like I know Jane Michael-Levy didn't invent this question, but like what are the one or two or three things that that you could change that you couldn't change on your own? Oh, I'm seeing Harriet's popped in.
Yeah, finally. I'm sorry. I got so distracted by trying to do things that I can't do on my practice.
It's okay.
Because we were away so long that I just, lost everything.
Harriet, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Hello.
Well, we're about 35 minutes into recording the episode, Harriet. Let's see. We could give you a brief summary and then like keep going if you want. And
I'd like to do that because I had quite a few thoughts on it.
Okay.
Late as I am.
Okay. Let's see, Jen or Tedwood, do you have what would be your summary of our discussion thus far?
Jen, are you better at this than me? I think you might be.
Well, I guess we have been talking about, boss versus worker psychology and where the defensiveness and emotional reaction of the boss comes from, and that they're and somewhat validating their feelings in that maybe they feel like, oh, they built this up from nothing, and this is an attack on this thing that they've built, but also invalidating that because the workers, through their labor, have made this workplace more valuable, and the boss is, making themselves richer out through that labor. And so workers absolutely have the right and should unionize so that they can have a seat at the table. But we were also talking about the worker psychology too, of just the fears that people might have and how the workers can overcome those fears.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then I think that last bit that to me is always inspiring. This when it kind of clicks psychologically for a worker to think like, oh well, on the one hand, it's a self-interest or quote unquote selfish interest of I can get more stuff for me if I work with others because I couldn't get it on my own. But then when a bunch of workers realize that, then you're kind of moving toward like a collective way of thinking, right? Like, so, and then that seems to be like one of the best sort of buffers against that sense of fear and helplessness in a workplace. And if you can and it sounds like just getting to this point it takes a long time and a lot of work, but if you can actually get into like a sort of flow of that, well, now like we meet regularly, we make plans together, we act as one in a lot of situations, that now you're kind of like boosting it. It's almost like a resiliency, like moving from like, trauma to resilience is like a, term that we're using in therapy now a lot. That if you can get there, then I would think that there's a lot more hopefulness and happiness and, and also just people working together, like probably stronger connections between coworkers because they're seen as like needing each other. So anyway, that's the summary, I think, of unless Ted, would you add something else to add there?
I guess the only thing I would add is like, we talked a little bit about, why it's important to preempt what's going to happen and make sure people understand that there's going to be a fight. There's a reason that we use the medical terminology inoculation in organizing discussions, and that's mainly to give you a little bit of the fear so that when the actual thing happens, you can make fun of it, basically. So, yeah.
Well, I've had a lot of thoughts about this, even though I certainly haven't been prompt. But jumping in now, I mean, one of the things I thought of is that because of the culture of America, in which things that are run like a business are supposed to be well run, even though most businesses fail, and why should you run something on the basis that one person is trying to get rich off the labor of others? But there is this corporate psychology. And the way I've been thinking about it is people should understand that in slave times, it was the slave and the master. In feudalism, it was the lord and the serf. In capitalism, it's the employer and the employee. And in each case, people worked and gave a large portion of their wealth up to the slaveholder, to the lord of the manor, to the capitalist. And the labor was done by those below who were denied a sense of their own power and their own contribution. In feudalism and slavery, it was through religion. God intends this. In capitalism, it's through a culture of eulogizing the corporate sector, hiring people from the corporate sector, and having them be part of the government as if they deserved it because they were in charge of making money for those who already have it. And that culture, the absence of that culture, I think, is what caused people to fail in Bessemer, Alabama, and really mitigates against unionism. And so when I think about organizing, I think of both the empowerment of your rightful share and also an understanding that this place has been controlled by capitalists much more than, let's say, it is in Germany or France, where workers' solidarity traditions are so much stronger because if you were white, and even if you were white and male, you couldn't make it if you really tried. There wasn't class mobility except by group organizing, which is why the German metal workers now have a 22-hour work week at the same salary. But that part of it, as an organizer, imagining myself as a labor organizer, I've been a civil rights organizer, feminist organizer, a peace organizer, and a organizer for midwifery rights at hospital and for public school organizer, that there are two parts. One is showing people your rightful place is not subservience, and that there's a long tradition of convincing you that it is, but that's wrong. And you can take your power together, and you can't take it alone, because the laws are written, as they say, the battle history is written by the victor of the battle. The laws are written by the dominant class and their lobbyists these days, even though there are countervailing pressures, but that labor consciousness of the power of labor and of the working class was basically expunged in the McCarthy era in the 1950s and didn't start a return until 2011 with Occupy, which Obama crushed in every city across the nation on the same day. So there's considerable pressure against the 99%, 1% class analysis idea, and that too has to be addressed in organizing because it's suppressed in the culture. In order to successfully organize, I think you have to go to the community and do something against this culture of sympathy with the corporate elite, which permeates our society and gets me so angry just thinking about it.
Yeah, same. You've riled me up a little bit, actually.
Yes. No, I 100% agree that it is a very deeply ingrained cultural thing. And something that I keep coming back to over and over is that we talk about solidarity. We talk about having each other's backs. But for workers in the United States, they have never seen that in action. And so when I say, I have your back, we have solidarity with each other, they have no reason to believe you because they have not seen that in practice. And going back to, I guess, worker psychology a little bit, and reflecting on our organizing campaign for Floyd, one of the kind of cohorts that we saw that were the most enthusiastic and gung-ho about unionizing tended to be queer folks. So yeah, gay, lesbian, trans folks or non-binary people. And I think it's because those people have an experience of coming out and being supported by a community. And that experience is not reflected in, an American worker's day-to-day life generally.
Super
That's
interesting.
really smart, because what the gay rights movement did, starting with ACT UP, we're here, we're queer, get used to it, is educating the public about the fact that people are not necessarily binary and are still people. And I think there has been, since the McCarthy period, with the brief interruption and beginnings of 2011 Occupy movement, an absence of the culture of labor. And so citing what people have done in Europe, how when the gas workers are on strike, the transit workers also stop everything, so do the electricity workers, and so do the teachers, and so on, because that shows that it is our work that keeps this place going, which is why the yellow vests were supported by the majority of the French, even though things were more inconvenient because subways were closed and so on. That there is a sense of us together, which is very important. And Martin Luther King wrote very well about that. He wrote that the best way to end racism is unions, because we're in it together around things that count for all of us. And the more divisions among us, the more those divisions can be used, because the Longshoremen's Union used to discriminate against blacks, and then blacks were used as strikers in their strikes. They were used as strike breakers. And so they decided, along with the progressive leadership, socialist leadership, okay, everybody's welcome. And then their strikes weren't broken anymore.
By the way,
when King came, he gave a great speech, which would be super to quote.
Yeah. By the way, that Martin Luther King quote about, unions being the best way to end racism is, I've heard that used as a fuck you question to bosses during captive audience meetings to shut down the rhetoric. So
to quote it and just be like, do you or do you not agree with Dr. Martin Luther King kind of thing? That's really smart.
It especially resonates in here in Atlanta, and that's the examples when I've heard it being used with like progressive or even black CEOs in Atlanta who are often asked this and stop dead in their tracks during a captive.
Yeah. And the original strike of the buses that got Martin Luther King noticed, that was everybody in solidarity to stop the racist policies of seating blacks in the back. But that there has to be a community. And so if I were an organizer now, as I was, I guess this is a story of how I organized in the past to change the educational system. I was a teacher in a really terrible school, which was 99% minority and had a drunken principal and inadequate supplies. And parents would come in and ask questions, and I'd say, yeah, you think just not having toilet paper, you think that's all we don't have? Call me at home. And me and 5 other teachers got, with the help of the registrar, got every parent's name and address and phone, and we visited everyone to tell them in that community your kid is not being educated. And they won't stand a chance in life if they're not educated. And we were all teachers. And they had very successful strikes against that school, and the civil rights movement of New Haven, Connecticut was born there. But we knew we wouldn't win if it was just teachers. We had to talk to the parents. We had to get into the community. And so I think part of a union effort is to reach the community where you're unionizing in whatever ways you can. For us, it was sitting in people's kitchens talking in order to gain that solidarity and the realization of the necessity for our cause.
Yeah.
And in your case, for a union, because I think that's why labor's been taking a shellacking since Reagan's idea, since Reagan suspended Patco and the traffic controllers, that labor had forgotten the community element and the political element when socialism, well, first communism and then what they considered the fellow travelers, socialists, and the other fellow travelers, militant labor organizers were fired from the unions and were vilified. That process of getting into the community and trying to change that ideology, that corporate ideology, would be a crucial thing in labor organizing.
Yeah, absolutely. Before you jumped on, Harriet, we were talking about what helps workers overcome. One of the things that helps workers overcome the fear and I guess the backlash that comes from employers is it's basically the relationship, which is, I think, around what you're talking about. Like, and I had said earlier, like, is your relationship with your community, meaning your coworkers and every, relevant part of, your whole self related to your labor, is that relationship stronger than the relationship you have with the person who pays you a wage, So,
well, it's not just the relationship. There is a power differential in the class society of employer-employee, wealthy, non-wealthy.
Yeah.
And the only countervailing power is that we do the work.
Right.
And so without us, they don't make any money. And there's a real example in the United States now where radio stations are picking up that employers need employees and that there's a labor shortage. No, there isn't. You pay people better, they'll work. That they're getting spoiled by benefits. No, pay them well. Then they'll come back. And that's not even part of the radio discourse on places like NPR, liberals.
Right.
Yeah.
And so but it makes sense to people if you talk to them.
I wonder what y'all think. Like, I almost see like these two separate routes toward wanting to actually be involved in a union at work. One is that self-interest piece, and one is, there's probably more than two, but another is like we're now talking about like history and the macro, like solidarity, almost things that are like beyond yourself and part of this like greater good mentality. Because like I've been drawn to, I think, if you're more of like an activist type or whatever, you'll often be drawn to that, outside of like, oh, well, I might get, they might finally put gluten-free snacks in the break room or whatever, if you're, like little, like kind of little things like that, because some people are moved by that. Right. But, I guess in y'all's experience in doing union organizing, do y'all find, does it tend to be more people, oh, okay, yeah, I guess I can get more stuff for me? I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that can just be an entry point, especially if you've never been like politically involved, or if you're not in this state of like, how do we build solidarity to like improve the world, versus, how many folks are like, I'm down for the cause because this is a cause, right? Like that more, outside of oneself, let's make things better together. Like, what do y'all see on the ground mostly?
Just speaking from the one campaign that Jen and I have gone from, beginning to end with, which is our own workplace. I kind of have to like compartmentalize it to the people who I saw were most successfully organized, like the most organized workers, like the people who, you know, started on one end, not really thinking about forming a union or organizing, to at the end of, you know, the whole ordeal, they were just like, this is a thing that needs to happen everywhere. Right. And with them, there ended up being like a very solid core of like 40 people out of, I want to say 125, who were like that. And I think for most people, what really motivated them was, you know, things beyond just their own workplace. Like in that case, I think it was like bettering the future of this industry so we can have more art, so we can have like a better place for animators in the South, so we don't have to all ship out to California. There were people who, you know, were primarily motivated and did a lot of work based on their own career aspirations or just, you know, personal vendettas against management or whatever. But yeah, among the people who, you know, were really in support of the union, I would say like the majority of them that I talked to were, you know, they saw how important it was for beyond just themselves, and they wanted to do something for it.
Yeah, I really think so, because if you think about what people actually get, they often don't really get compensated for the times they weren't being paid. And it's because there is a sense I cannot be humiliated. I can't be ripped off. Also, the French have a very good way of going on strike. I know this about the university system more than elsewhere, but in the university system, when they go on strike, they only do what's on their job description, and nothing works.
Yeah.
Because if you're in some kind of work, and I would think animation is the same thing, if you just do what is required, nothing will work properly, because it depends on you're putting yourself at the disposal of whatever you're doing.
Right. That means no late nights, no weekends.
That's right.
Yeah.
No, it's not in the contract.
Right.
That there is, because they're all ways of saying you are important. You are being thought of as a cipher in a profit ledger. You are a person with creative possibility here if you're dealing with animators, you know. That's right, an agency, and you're being treated like you're too stupid to know what's good for you. But you're not too stupid. And I remember a client of mine who was an organizer who organized restaurants, and he was organizing a retarded guy who washed dishes. And he said, just because you're retarded doesn't mean you're a person. You're not a person there, you know, so what? And you deserve a salary, and you deserve dignity for your work. Washing dishes is important. If they were served on dirty dishes, they wouldn't even eat at that restaurant. And the guy got a better sense of himself and voted for the union.
So it seems like a blend, right? Like there's individual stuff that inspires you and says, oh, well, I could improve my conditions. And then something clicks on that, like the greater good level, it sounds like. Jen, did you, just in your experience, do you have any like insights on that? Like, you know, which kinds of things have motivated workers?
I think that, and I apologize, there's like a leaf blower outside. I'm not sure if you can hear it.
A little bit.
I think that there is a kind of escalation that happens in people's interest of, you know, first, when that one-on-one conversation happens, we frame it in terms of like things that you are personally concerned about. But then once you are become integrated with the organizing and hear about other people's experience and build relationships with those workers, then you are in it for yourself and for your coworkers also. You want everyone to succeed because you have been, doing these meetings and putting this stuff together, sometimes, several times a week for weeks or months or years. So that relationship with your coworkers is what ultimately like expands your horizons of other stuff that you should be interested in, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like there's a like I've heard you say this before, there's a dialectical relationship between what your body does and what your heart will do.
Yes.
And vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
And isolation has been the real enemy of any kind of human progress.
And that's something that we have been seeing in our campaigns. Unfortunately, our current society is so atomized that we have a really big challenge in terms of, so what you were saying earlier, Harriet, of going to the communities and being integrated with the communities. But union organizers today have, their work cut out for them, because honestly, workers have become atomized to the point where they aren't really part of, larger communities.
Right.
And so it becomes that much harder to reach them.
It is. The media is out there, and it's creating media messages and social media messages and things like that in the community that are important, even though people are atomized, they're also terribly lonely.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I mean, I've found, because there's parallels between, labor and tenant organizing. It's not 100%, but there's some similarities, and I've been doing a lot of that over the last year. And one, like, kind of, I mean, for me, it's a little bit depressing, because I've seen what you just mentioned, Jen, the atomization thing, as being really amplified in the tenant organizing world, because you'll get these really big apartment buildings where, similar idea to with labor organizing, where it's like, well, if you could like build plant the seed for the tenants to understand that if all of you form, a tenant association, just like basically a union, like in the apartment building, in a 10 unit, 50 unit, 100, 1,000 unit building, build an organizing committee, et cetera, you can collectively bargain, you'll have better relationships. I mean, you could actually bullet list probably 10 things that tenants would benefit from in this regard. You might be able to, like, so-and-so can do some childcare for you. So-and-so really likes to barbecue. So they'll just, a couple weekends a month or something, they might, make some ribs and everybody can come out, have a beer together. And this is, whether it was COVID or not, because I know COVID right now has made people kind of paranoid to have contact. But we've just found that, I mean, maybe Santa Barbara, California is like unique, but I kind of don't think so. That like a lot of folks are like, why are you knocking at my door? Whether you're an organizer or you're just my neighbor, I just kind of want to watch TV and not talk to anybody. Mm-hmm. And so something that, I'm not saying this to be like, let's just give up hope or whatever, but I do think that there has been, because of all the things that Harriet, you always so articulately outlined, from basically post World War II to like the 70s to this like neoliberal era thing. I think because of deindustrialization, outsourcing of jobs, yada, 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 the globalization of the economy, people aren't, I think you've mentioned, Harriet, there's statistics on like the number of people that used to be part of like bowling leagues and crap, right? So whether you were
people active in anything,
right?
And we're in bowling leagues,
knitting groups or something, right? Just whatever, right? That like Jen was saying, like that's just not really the way the cultural fabric anymore, right? In the United States. So I think there's become this internalized psychology of like distrust people, kind of just feel really either socially awkward or like socially anxious. I don't really want to build connections with people nearby me. I kind of want to keep to myself. So, I mean, in my experience, it's been hard to break through that, where it's like, how do you convince someone, you can go from the self-interest thing of like, well, you might be able to get a rent reduction, or you might be able to the landlord to fix the heater, or, in a tenant environment or a labor environment. But to get people to actually think like, it may be worth it to just like connect with people, period. Mm-hmm. That's like really, it makes me sad to think that that's not on more people's minds, or when the seed is planted, they're like, yeah, maybe, but nah, never mind. I'm good.
Well, I think that maybe it's just me, My son used to say you could have a conversation with a doorknob. It's true that wherever I go in New York City, and when I used to go on the subway, I'd start conversations with people and we'd end up having a deep conversation. But there's something about a person just talking about their experience and asking you about yours as an introduction to what issues there are.
Yeah.
What is it like working there? And this is what I found, that just to get your agenda, not from the top, but from the experience of people telling you what their experience is and then address them through their experience. Because people do want to be respected.
So we get it. Bosses have psychological problems. Workers just need more unions to treat their sense of alienation, depression, anxiety. We figured it out. I'm figuring that. I mean, we're a little over on the hour, which is. I mean, I could go a bit longer.
Sorry, I came in late too. That messed it up.
Oh, it's okay.
That's quite all right.
I'm curious if y'all, for Tedwin and Jen, something that gives the two of you hope in this difficult situation that we outlined, right? Like very atomized, isolated American culture. What's given you hope despite the challenges in getting workers together to improve conditions?
Well, what has given me hope is basically through going through the motions of struggle and having people respond positively, even though, maybe they've never talked to anyone, outside of work before. And, even in the course of our campaign, I had many conversations where people told me flat out, you are the first person that has ever asked me what I think about my workplace.
Yeah.
And that, I guess it gives me hope that maybe we can be like the seeds of getting people to think about these things. And, maybe it won't happen in this campaign or in the next campaign, but eventually people will realize that they deserve to be heard and that they, are deserving of respect, and that this doesn't have to be a one-off conversation. And maybe they can be the ones that are having these conversations in the future. So, well, I guess, the process of organizing is what gives me hope, and seeing that people respond to it.
Yeah, because people have not been consulted about anything. Maybe the kind of toothpaste they want. But in terms of anything meaningful about their lives, they're really not consulted. And so just to take people seriously and talk to them and say, we want to address your concerns. What is it like? What are your concerns? These are some concerns that I have or that other people have, and then listening. And that was the way we built the feminist movement, consciousness raising, talking about your life. And from that, issues emerged.
Yeah, like affirmation, acceptance.
Yeah. And solidarity and commonality of shared experience.
I think the thing that gives me hope is a little dark, but it's kind of my MO. So I'm just going to power through it. Things are getting, I'm not really convinced that things are any worse than they've ever been. They're bad. Things are bad. But I think there are points of really raised and obvious like contradictions between, you, a person working and living in this world, and people who make all the decisions that are relevant to all the most important aspects of your life. Sometimes they're very apparent, and those are the points where people are sometimes forced to struggle. I have hope in that, as people are pushed towards either community or barbarism. The people like all of us here who are always trying to find ways to foster community are going to be there, and the people who have not been looking for those things and suddenly need them will find us. It might be a little bit idealist of me, but there's some intentionality there. Obviously, we have to put the work in. It's not just going to happen, but that's what gives me hope.
Well, I want to also say that when there's a bad snowstorm or something, people generally are very solid with each other and help one another.
Yeah. It's not like in video games and in the movies where, people are suddenly driving Frankenstein automobiles on desert highways looking for gas and killing every stranger that they see. Like, it's not like that.
It's not like that. People generally are solid. And in New York City, you could see it, especially when the results came out that Donald Trump lost. People were singing in the street. They were playing music. And there were celebrations that were spontaneous. People doing it together.
Yeah.
And most Americans are in urbanized settings where they are together.
Right.
And count on each other.
Yeah. And Jen, you're from Puerto Rico. Like, I know you noticed a lot of, community solidarity popping up all over the island during the aftermath of Maria, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And actually that experience of Hurricane Maria is what has propelled the kind of autonomous community meetings and mutual aid that are now, building up strength and, led to the ousting of Governor Rosselló. And so, that experience of that lived struggle with your community in order to, frankly survive, and people seeing that it's possible has broadened their horizons and hopefully will bring about larger structural changes to Puerto Rico.
Particularly if people build on it quite consciously.
Yeah. I mean, I think in Santa Barbara we haven't had an enormous fire in a couple of years now, but there's one called the Thomas Fire. Y'all just reminded me of that, of the level of community togetherness that came out of that, because not only was it a fire, but then there was a mudslide that killed a bunch of people because everything in the hills was burnt out. It was just crazy. There's something about that crisis. I guess that this is making me think of, what makes me hopeful then is, because I think that, the thing that gets me down sometimes is realizing that we're already in a crisis. We don't need this, okay, this maybe sounds weird, but it's the frustrated part of me says we don't need a hurricane or a whatever to get people to realize we need each other. But whatever, because we're already in sort of, the hurricane of capitalism or whatever. But when you see it, it people just come together. I think there's just almost, I don't know if it's biological or what. It's just snap out of it, go outside, help people talk to each other, figure it out. We need to get through this together. It just happens. So I see that too, even in the tenant organizing stuff. I have seen, instead of just, I shouldn't narrate this as nobody wants to organize. We've seen, especially people in the same building, when they're oh, the landlord just sent us a bunch of notices, or they're doing all this crazy construction. Are they going to evict us? Suddenly tenants who weren't talking together are talking together. They may not really know, they're feeling shy, or they don't know how to talk. They're I don't know about that guy. That guy seems weird. Or that woman has I don't know, her music's too loud in her apartment and she annoys me or whatever. But people kind of get over it pretty quickly, and they'll be oh shit, what do we do to address this shared issue? So I think one common thread I'm hearing all say is just when there is a shared struggle, community emerges, people are working together, and then that sense of solidarity is now felt, right? It's not theoretical. No one's lecturing at them we need solidarity. It's not even a political activism thing. It's it's embodied, right? And people are just going with the solidarity now. So that for sure gives me hope too.
There's also a culture out there that if there's a tragedy, you're supposed to stick together. And we can build that around labor, as many others do, that we have to stick together because we're the ones that keep it running, although they're not paid. People who are essential workers were essential. It wasn't bankers that were essential.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Something else really like kind of vaguely hopeful about all of this is that I was watching a debate with Dr. Wolf and some internet asshole on YouTube,
Mm-hmm.
and he kept making the point of like the transitions between different organizations of society, like from feudalism to capitalism, and the idea of transitioning from capitalism to socialism to communism. Like it's there's no hard line. There are so many wins and losses in that period, and I guess the hopeful thing there is that you're going to lose some struggles. You're going to lose a lot of them if you organize long enough. Like you'll probably lose more fights than you win.
Yeah.
But that does not mean that things are not going in the right direction. An older comrade of mine came over a couple months ago, and he said something really poignant to me, which was, you're walking on a road at night. There's no lights. Trying to get home. The only way that you're able to find your way are flashes of lightning to illuminate what's around you. And in between those flashes of lightning, you just kind of remember which direction you need to keep going to stay on the road. And, sparks of struggle are just like those flashes of lightning. And I don't know, that's just something that helps me feel like, yeah, it's going to be okay.
I think it is
beautiful.
too. And there's something, I think it was Lenin said it. He said, there are decades when nothing happens. Speaking of their organizing, there are weeks when decades happen.
Right. Yeah.
And you don't know, you do all of this spade work to create a foundation, but it does accumulate.
Yeah.
It really does accumulate.
Yeah. I think too, like, sometimes I think this idea of like planting seeds and ripple effects of consciousness, sometimes I think it sounds a little naive. It's like, well, but is that really happening? But I mean, I've definitely seen it. I've seen it happen. I know it happened with myself. I mean, even just, I know for like the IWW's OT 101 training, organizer training 101, I like it changed the way I saw workplaces and coworkers. And then when I was transferring the information to other people of like, well, here's what I've learned. Like there are actually, I think, like really significant ripple effects in consciousness and perspective on an individual and then person to person level. Whether it's from like formal trainings, people getting more interested in like reading theory online now, like the super online left, to the things that you learn in struggle, and that it translates. Because the other thing I think that is, again, it's a challenge, but it's an interesting opportunity right now where because of what the economy has done to people is that people stay in the same place for far shorter amounts of time, like the same job, the same, place they're renting from or whatever, same home they own or don't own. And so although it creates challenges, well, like how the hell can we build like a sustainable long-term community if everybody has to leave all the time, right? But I think it's also maybe, since Tedwood, you're using such beautiful metaphors, maybe it's like pollen or spores of mushrooms or something, where it's like, well, sure, if you can build that consciousness wherever you are, and once it clicks for people, if they do have to uproot and go somewhere else, they're still going to have the same level of consciousness, and they may unionize their workplace or form a tenant association or lead, organize a march or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a bit of muscle memory here that is pretty relevant, So yeah, I mean, you never forget how to ride a bike, I guess. I guess it's the same with a lot of organizing strategies.
Yeah, exactly.
And the U.S. is changing. I mean, there is an opening towards unions that wasn't there before, because people are shafted, and the myth of this horrible, odious term, self-made man, and the idea that if only you're white and male, you can make it if you really try. No, you can't. And a president who got elected because his father gave him $214 million to start, and who gifts only rich people and gives big tax breaks to rich people, people became aware. Those 660 billionaires that were made during the pandemic, when more than 60% of Americans had some period of unemployment, has got to come home. And I think it has. So people are open in a way that they weren't.
I've got to say that the idea of a self-made man to me is disgusting. It brings up the grossest imagery I can imagine of somebody making themselves.
It's anti-mother.
It's anti-mother. It's anti-mother.
It's
Anti-mother propaganda.
Like you assembled yourself out of primordial ooze.
Right. And no one's discoveries are theirs alone. Everybody builds on what's there. And it's this sort of individualist denial of community, which has to be fought. We
had this critical and liberation psychology professor named Bethany Morris on a few weeks ago. And she, I think it's one of the most beautiful questions she asks her students is, can you basically prove to me you're an individual? Like, tell me what are the things about you that make you an individual? And then she pushes back on all of them. And she even, when people start to describe even their individual dreams and their own individual thoughts, she's like, well, where did you get your language from? Where did you get the English language from, or Mandarin or whatever? And I'd never really thought of that. Right. But the degree to which we are so, objectively, this isn't woo-woo stuff. We're objectively tied to thousands of years of history and culture and, migration and yada, yada. I think when that clicks for people too, right? In terms of solidarity, I think the yearning for solidarity becomes stronger once you kind of psychologically understand how interconnected we are.
Yeah, once you realize what it feels like to not only recognize your own agency and right to self-determination, but to be around others who have the same agency and recognition of their right to self-determination.
And that their self is dependent on your self is dependent on their self determination.
Right.
But it's a collective process.
Yeah.
And so, and that counts enormously in this country.
Can I ask y'all a question? Do y'all feel like, I think I almost answered my own question in my head, but do y'all think that bosses, CEOs, billionaires around the world have a sense of solidarity? I mean, I guess my knee jerk would be to say they have solidarity with each other, but I mean, what do y'all think?
Oh, I totally think so. I think it's a different kind of solidarity. But I almost think it's this, maybe this sounds like Marxy, but if you almost think base superstructure, that sort of the hegemony crap, the stuff at the top, the ideologies, whether it's self-made man or, we actually just had in Santa Barbara, there was an op-ed written by this guy named Theo Crack, or I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but he's the owner of this company called Paradise Retreats. He pushed back against a lawsuit here to ban short-term rentals like Airbnbs and stuff in the city. He won. The city appealed it. It just lost again within the higher court. And he just wrote this really, hopefully this will answer your question in a second. It was this really, I thought I was really disgusted by the op-ed, and it was basically here's why short-term rentals and vacation rentals in Santa Barbara have basically no impact on housing affordability and tenants having access to stuff. And it's just this long thing. And he was citing studies by basically a local think tank called the Economic Forecast Group.com or some crap. And it's all real estate. It's all, really high up there corporate, millionaire people that are part of national think tanks. And I'm sitting there why would you even publish with your name on it? Just to understand this guy's psychology, why are you saying, I'm so proud that the millions of dollars that me and our think tanks just paid these people to these corporate lawyers to fight the city so that we can rent out really expensive vacation rentals to tourists? Why are you so proud of yourself that you're coming out now saying we won? And by the way, none of this negatively impacts housing in Santa Barbara. So he is in solidarity, I think, just with capital generally.
Oh yeah, there's plenty of people who read that and they were like, good form, sir.
I mean, there's probably tenants. I mean, there's probably ordinary people that are like, well, he makes a good point or something, right? Because of the ideology around us. But he's not in solidarity with tenants, with ordinary people. He's not in solidarity with the immigrant families that have been displaced, that have to take 2-hour commutes to work here now for like really low wage jobs. He doesn't give a shit about anybody. And it's not just himself. I think it's like this, it's almost getting high on this idea, like that self-made man idea that like I won, I fought the government so I can keep doing good business or whatever, right? And then the whole business community is in solidarity with him. So I think he did it not just for himself, but as a sense of solidarity for sure.
Well, the CEOs are kind of like the pharaoh of modern society when they're at the top. And I think they have solidarity on some issues, but they're also ready to sell each other out in a heartbeat.
Right. That's their weakness.
Yeah. Good point.
It's a falling out among thieves whenever they're called up and questioned. Yeah. You can watch them betray each other, like Trump's minions. They'll all knock each other out if they get a little break. Right. Because the basic solidarity isn't there. They have a solidarity around issues that benefit their entire class position, but on things they don't.
And that's why they're so threatened by a challenge to a system that serves their ability to do that.
That's exactly right. And they know somewhere that they don't deserve what they have. And so they're combative against being questioned. And they have captured the reins of our government for a long time. And ordinary people have been taught, starting with Reagan, that our problem is the government, not the corporate structure of capitalism. The government's their only chance. And that was to smash down on the wonderful big government of the New Deal, which they didn't want to repeat. But people are changing and understanding that.
I think I might want to become a CEO now, actually.
Yeah. I'm looking up investment portfolios as we speak. So
that's right.
Yeah.
Well, I hope you all get rich.
Yeah. Well, that's another that thing where like the self-made man, the American dream idea. I feel like there's solidarity with that fantasy a little bit too, right? Where like even in the campaign that y'all were talking about earlier, that guy, that boss, probably not only from that individual view of I put in my heart, sweat, and tears and soul into this company or whatever, but like there's probably he's on this cloud in his mind of like, this is how you make it, I'm going to really make it in that American sense, like not realizing, like it's like 50 people can do that or whatever, or like, like Harriet said of like 600 whatever billionaires, like there can't be that many billionaires or millionaires. Like this, you have to step on people to get there. But he's in solidarity with the fantasy. Yeah.
Right. Or you have to inherit it. What's becoming more apparent is that people are where they are because they got the money from somebody else, from their parents. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in 1970, the United States was the most egalitarian nation of all the developed nations in the world. Now it's the least egalitarian. Mm-hmm. And that message is coming home.
Mm-hmm. And of course, there are ordinary people who are like, not any individual can unlock this ancient secret, but perhaps I have the potential. And, and, if I raise the capital, then, I can be like this one day. I mean, even in that campaign that Jen and I were just coming off of, there was this one guy, he used to be a close friend of mine. He always used to say like, hey, look, I'm left to the guillotine. Okay. but things are never going to change, and your best bet is to just try to do well for yourself. And when the union campaign rolled around, he didn't even work at the workplace. He's like a spouse of one of the workers there. He was like doing calls to workers saying like, hey, you hear about this union business? Like they're going to vote away your child care. Like, this is really stupid. Like it's a bunch of rabble rousing. Like don't buy into that, and knowing his motivations to like, I someday want to be rich.
Ultimately it's a solidarity to a system that maybe can make you rich one day, and not to fellow human beings.
And like at the
Well,
expense
it
of,
doesn't make you rich anymore. I mean, one of the things
yeah,
that's dawning on the mass consciousness is that social mobility is not happening.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe if
Yeah.
you're a rock star who suddenly gets recognized, but basically it's not happening and
Yeah.
it won't happen.
And even then, even if you become like, if you're LeBron James, you still don't have full agency over everything
That's
that you've been able to accumulate.
That's right. And look, people love sports in America because it's one thing where you can't just have the boss's son who can't play basketball,
Right.
that you actually have to have some merit to be on these teams, some skill. It's not just connections, but people do understand that most everything else does depend on that.
Yeah.
And even with all of the millions that those basketball players make, they have a union.
They do. They absolutely do.
Good point.
Yeah.
That's a really good point,
Yeah.
and you need it.
Yeah, y'all remember when Obama came out of nowhere to kill the MPA strike?
Yeah.
That was fun.
man, poor Obama. Poor Obama. Seems so cool. On the campaign trail, he's like the coolest guy. He made me want to like learn to dance and like,
Yeah.
I don't know, just be like a more social person. I was like, I need to like, take the top button on my collar down and like, I just need to like be cool, man. And then he's like, drone strike.
Well, when I see Obama, I think about how the same thing colored and brown is the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or the same thing with the vagina. It's still the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, y'all. All right, so strike. Let's go on strike.
Yep, we're doing it tomorrow.
Liam should go on strike. He does our editing and stuff. He should just be like, give me more than 33% of the Patreon money. We actually forgot. I'll just do that. It's a good segue. I actually totally forgot in the beginning to say a big thank you to our patrons. First Winter, Sarah Turner, Rebecca Johns, Justin Harper, and Bandile Msimanga, and Liam. I'm bowing down because I'm happy I don't have to do the editing anymore. You're my favorite person.
Editors make the world go around.
Yes.
For real.
Yeah, I don't think people even understand, like, because it's pretty, you have to like go. Imagine just, dear listeners, like just watching these visuals of the audio and going through and being like, oh, that was a thing, and then you have to delete that, or you have to silence one thing, or you have to. It's like pretty tedious work. So props to Liam for that.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
And thank you for our guests too. Thank you so much.
Of course, like props to you all. This podcast is great. I've enjoyed it for a while, and I'm just so happy to be on and talk about this.
Yeah. Thanks for having us. And honestly, it's been kind of a decompression exercise for me.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Would y'all want to I forgot to ask this in the beginning, if you wanted we could put in the description if folks were like, I want to unionize my workplace. How do I contact Jen and Tedwood? Could I put maybe after you can tell me if you want to put your emails or Twitter handles or something like that. Would you be open to people contacting you for that?
Yeah.
How about you, Jen?
Yeah. I'd be open to that.
Yeah.
Okay. Folks can, I'll give you all the info, but you can go to CODE-CWA.org. I think it's code-CWA.org to find out, when our trainings are, if you work in the tech industry, or if you're just a digital employee at all, if you work in media, come organize with us.
Okay. And if there's any other reformed animators out there who want to connect with Jen, I guess, because she's leading the reformed animator movement. I don't even know what that means. But.
Yeah, I think that, media is so important to how we, understand, the world that we live in. And that is why it's so important to unionize those workplaces, because the messages that they put out are what, serve as a kind of propaganda for, our daily life. And so it's important that workers have a say in how that media gets made. And especially in the South, that is, the unionization in the South is basically non-existent. So I'm very interested in trying to, boost those numbers and get people more conscious and aware and struggling together.
Awesome.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Alrighty, y'all. And if anybody wants to contact us with reactions to the episode, it's not just in your head at gmail.com. If you want to become a patron to support, get early access and other perks and blah, 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 patreon.com/it's not just in your head. And
Thanks again, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah.
Take care.
We will miss you. It was a great conversation. You two are wonderful. Okay.
You too.
By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
Capitalism Hits Home is a sort of broader overhead view. It explores the way that capitalism shapes our personal lives, our psyches, our relationships, our families, and it looks particularly at the sea change in American personal life as all Americans, but the top 10 or 20% of Americans, have our security and our chance for a future become as precarious as it always was for minorities and families headed by women. It's not just in your head, and Capitalism Hits Home are definitely complementary.
And if listeners would like to check out Capitalism Hits Home, Harriet, where should they go to find it?
Either on YouTube or Democracy at Work or on my own website, harrietfraud.com.